How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.
Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, July the 7th. Nigel Farage arrived back in the UK from Independence Day celebrations in the US yesterday, but we haven't heard in any more detail about the weekend revelations from him. At some point in the next fortnight, we believe, before parliamentary recess, we expect the Commissioner for Standards to interview him about the previous allegations that he took £5 million in the run-up to the 2024 elections, which he should have declared. But we're yet to hear whether Daniel Greenberg is going to extend his investigation to the latest claims, which Mr. Farage has said are a stitch-up by a media out to get him. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. Pressure continuing to grow on the Reform leader. The party is saying that pre-election benefits from an ally, George Cottrell, were not declared because they weren't political in nature. He has no official role in Reform, and they were made in a way that indicated that they were personal favours to Farage and nothing to do with the donor structure of the party.
You've got The Guardian picking away at that this morning. They've done an analysis of the party's events showing George Cottrell is frequently present at party press conferences and backstage at rallies, as well as joining Nigel Farage for media appearances, including interviews with protesters outside the Iranian embassy earlier this year.
Well, Reform insiders telling me that Farage will keep backing his friend. They argue that all of this is really a case of two loyal people who spend a lot of time together, do each other favours in the normal way. And as George Cottrell has quite a lot of resource and is loyal to the Reform cause, that he smooths his friend Nigel Farage's path where he can. They're saying, these Reform heavy hitters, that this story won't affect the kind of solid base they see as giving the party that steady 25% or so in the polls. But one senior figure did concede to me that having these running rows, Sam, about gifts from some colourful donors and benefactors, let's call them, might well put off some Tory middle class voters from moving over to the Reform column if they thought it was all just a bit too rum and eventful. And they're citing there particularly Cottrell's previous conviction in the US for wire fraud. And that is an issue if the party wants to get its trajectory moving upwards again towards the high 20s, where it starts looking more on track perhaps for Downing Street than if it's below that. Not everyone around Reform loves Posh George, as he is called, because of his extraordinary family connections, which plug him right in, actually, to the old conservative aristocratic establishment. He's got more front than Brighton Pier, as one donor told me last night. That's quite a lot of pier and quite a lot of front. But he said this is Nigel's world, and he brings his own people, and he's fiercely loyal.
What's really interesting, I was watching Jacob Rees-Mogg yesterday give an interview. Now, he is firmly in the Conservative camp, but is, I think as we could all acknowledge, Nigel Farage friendly. And his line on this was a bit more testing, a bit more aggressive than I was expecting. He said that simply being associated with someone who has been to federal penitentiary and has been convicted with wire fraud is a problem for any political leader. Jacob, I think, normally can be relied on to come to the defence of Nigel Farage. So I thought it was striking that even he was drawing a distinction. And I think there are so many different aspects of this that are being picked apart, not least the question of whether it does all end up in a by-election, because I'm sure your Reform sources are absolutely right that there is a really quite hardy residual base of support for Reform, but there is also simply parliamentary rules that to be a member of Parliament you need to be obey, and if to be seen to obey and to to be judged to be upholding. And if Daniel Greenberg suggests that there should be a recall petition, then a recall petition there will be, and that could take us to a by-election. But your reform source is absolutely right when it comes to this morning's Schools on the Doors, Tuesday morning, voting intention from YouGov with Sky and The Times. That has Reform UK on 25%, up 1 percentage point on last week. Tories on 21%, so not a huge gap there. They're also up 1. Labour on 20, Greens on 13, Lib Dems on 12.
13 days to go till Andy Burnham becomes Prime Minister. Westminster getting itchy to know a bit more about what that might portend. Any thoughts?
So we are told Andy Burnham is sketching together his policy vision and his structure of government. So we were musing yesterday whether or not he might end up rewiring the top of government, and in particular what he might do with the Treasury. It feels like there has been now some movement on that. This morning, the FT are reporting that Andy Burnham has put to bed one of the ideas being discussed about splitting the Treasury in two and giving the role of deciding how much departments get to spend to either another government department or to a sort of enhanced number 10. This was an idea being pushed by Andy Haldane, the economist backing Burnham, and also by Lou Haig in a pamphlet just before the Makerfield by-election. But I think the prospect of disruption seems to be the reason why they might not go ahead with it. Sort of 2 years of Whitehall arguing with itself over who decides what will have discouraged a team that I was talking to members of the Burnham team yesterday. They know that they've got to do a couple of, deliverables in pretty short order when it comes to their first few days in power.
And that's a reminder of how tricky it is going to be for Andy Burnham to get through that reorganisation, if you like, that he seems to be promising decentralisation, at the same time deliver hard and fast in his first budget. The Office for Budgetary Responsibility is doing its annual assessment of fiscal risks today, and that covers things like falling migration and the impact of that on the economy, as well as the analysis of pressures from defence and welfare in the next decades. And you can imagine, Sam, that's probably not going to conclude that there's nothing to worry about. So the OBR also promising to set out analysis of UK marginal tax rates compared to other competitor countries. And one overarching question is how far Burnham continues to feel bound by his predecessor, and particularly by the Chancellor Rachel Reeves's approach. Now, she is still going to give the Mansion House speech, that big shebang, dressy event, next Tuesday. Dan Bloom, my Politico colleague, pointing out this morning, the Treasury didn't want that postponed, whatever becomes of the Chancellor herself. A lot of city folk, however, thinking that she laid out reforms that she hoped would embolden them and raise their animal spirits last year. This year, those of them going along at kind of watching what could be a valedictory performance. And there it is in a nutshell. You've got this big ta-da moment for the Chancellor in their year. And at the same time, it feels as if they could be leaving the stage. And that's the sort of, they need to get through this period pretty quickly, I think. Otherwise, the animal spirits just get more and more confused.
Yeah, I was just thinking, if Andy Burnham had indicated who his choice for Chancellor was, then by the time you get to next Tuesday, you'd have the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and a sort of shadow Labour Chancellor in the form of her successor hovering around. Do they go? Do they not go? Do they sort of do a smiley face emoji on social media at the clips of the speech? It gets really, really tricky when you have two figures trying to do the same job. So very, very awkward. So one of the things that I've picked up from people around Andy Burnham is that they think an early mistake of Rachel Reeves was to delay the budget for quite such a long time. That was in particular true last year, but to a certain extent was true in 2024 as well. And having learned from that lesson, they're sort of, they're pushing Andy Burnham to do the opposite. Now, I think the earliest you could have a budget if you trigger the Office for Budget Responsibility OBR process the moment you come in is late September, but we're in conference season then. So that suggests to me that we could get a budget in October, maybe even another dreaded half-term budget if we're going along the timetable that some people are pushing for, precisely because leaving a vacuum with potentially the impact that has on growth and people withholding investment decisions until they see the sort of structure of Andy Burnham's tax proposals in the flesh could be the result. So we may not have long to wait. Certainly there is a feeling amongst people around Burnham that they know they've got a short window to capitalise on his entry into power. Some think it will be exciting. One person who thinks it's going to be exciting is somebody you've been speaking to, who has shed some light on one of the biggest enigmas, which is what on earth would an Andy Burnham foreign policy be like? And to that end, Anne, you've actually been talking to somebody who's an old friend of my reporting as well, to give us a guide to how that might be seen in Burnham world, and that is Jim O'Neill.
Yes, Jim Lord O'Neill, former Goldman Sachs banker, Labour's favourite banker, I think you could say, Northern Powerhouse minister under Cameron and Osborne for a while, and now clearly a key advisor to Burnham as he tries to put some flesh on the bones of that challenge that you were laying out there, Sam, how quickly to move, in which direction, and what to signal in terms of Britain and the world, but specifically, I think, on trading relationships and sort of growth friendly policies. So I spoke at length to Jim O'Neill for Politico, and he was keen to tell me, in terms of his role, that nothing formal had been agreed. We might want to take that with a pinch of salt there, Jim, but clearly he is in Andy Burnham's ear. Crucially, he is the guy who came up with the BRICS moniker for economies powering global growth. That was now quite a long time ago in the original list. Brazil, India, China, also had Russia in there. Well, that fell a bit by the wayside. But anyway, but he's now sort of looking to Britain's relations with those faster growing economies and saying essentially that we should get a bit less dependent on our dealings with the US. And that was a bit of a tilt here. Hear a clip from him now, away from Keir Starmer's hug 'em close approach to Donald Trump. Have a listen.
The only places in the world that overperformed our projections were India and China. The US, fascinatingly, and I didn't realize this, underperformed what we projected. So as we talk, it is widespread belief that the US is this place that's just incredible and grows like crazy and always will. It's doing okay, but it's not doing wunderbar. And, and so...
to coin an Americanism.
So, it's quite a reality check seeing something like that.
So would you put less emphasis on the trade relationship with the US?
Yes, because it's already extremely strong. But the second thing I would say, which goes deeper to your very interesting question, Anne, is the mindset of our civil service machine, many of whom I've had the pleasure of getting to know on and off the past 20-odd years, is obviously schooled in this sort of view of life that whatever's going on, you always side with the US. And to some degree, this first, 15, 16, nearly 18 months of Trump, Mark II, is finally shaking them up a bit, thinking we can't actually rely on these guys in the way that we used to. So maybe, and it's when I listen to them, they've not really shifted much at all. They're just assuming that, this is just a bit of a temporary thing and the US will become more sensible soon and it'll be back to normal. It's a bit of a wake-up call.
What do you make of that, Sam?
Look, I thought that was fascinating for a couple of reasons, because first of all, he wasn't making the traditional argument that you hear on the left, and Jim O'Neill is a crossbench peer, so he would reject that he's on the left. But normally you hear that we should be cautious about America because of Donald Trump. But his argument's different. It's that you should be cautious about America because America isn't the panacea and the economic sort of pick-me-up that it's often presented as being. It strikes me that in sort of raw economic numbers terms, I would never dare to go toe to toe with Jim O'Neill, but you have diplomacy and foreign policy alongside and intertwined with economics here. And whether or not that result yields a success on trading policy, which is and has been important for Keir Starmer's premiership, think cars, think trying to get relief on various industries, think whiskey. Whether or not it's global policy on things like AI, you just had the Anthropic row. If the White House thinks that the UK is in some sense downgrading them under an Andy Burnham premiership, sure, there may not be immediate economic dividends from that, but there is a reason why, the sort of the UK system genuflects in that direction. And it's because quite a lot does hinge on that. So whilst, of course, not being impossible and maybe being economically sensible, I think it would also require great care that other elements of UK-US policy don't fall away to the detriment of other bits of the economy. And I am thinking about that sort of big discussion that Yvette Cooper was trying to kickstart yesterday about how do we think about AI in an era where US and China have huge sovereign capability and the rest of us are a little bit left behind. Do we muscle in? Do we work alongside the US, or do we try and build our own capability? Like, all of that stuff just gets quite hard when it comes to if we decide to change our poise to the US to make it a little bit more distant.
Absolutely. And I think what's been pointed at here is, as you say, there's a financial and an economic analysis, and clearly Jim O'Neill leans more into this idea that you can't rely on the US anymore. You've got to tend other relationships, both for diplomatic purposes, but primarily he's thinking about trade. So he leans into a view on the international circuit that, for instance, Mark Carney has, the Canadian leader, to an extent, Alexander Stubb in Finland, which is just, if you've kind of fallen out to an extent with the US, or they've fallen out with you under Donald Trump, don't expect it to go back to normal. He was quite critical, I thought, in terms of talking about the British officialdom or establishment, saying they think it's going to go back to normal, but it probably isn't. Well, that would be pretty bracing for the reasons that you described, Sam. If you're alongside Andy Burnham, is that really, are you going to be able to say to this entire Whitehall system, you guys have been getting it all wrong? He's had a fun kind of sarky tone about that a bit. I've had the pleasure of meeting these people, they're wonderful, but I think they're wrong kind of vibe. So it'd be really interesting how far Burnham government really goes in that direction of separating off from America. But if you want to expand trade, then you're also into a closer relationship with China, which I think O'Neill is relatively open to, but that brings its own problems. Another thorny topic is the EU, and getting closer there on trade has implications which is sort of unfinished business for the Starmer era in terms of that closer ties to Europe, which we've covered on this podcast with much regularity, only to find that we haven't actually done the closening. And here's what O'Neill had to say about that.
I would hope the UK, a decade after the momentous decision to leave the EU, the UK finally starts to think more seriously about the role it can play globally. I was what I described myself as a modest Remainer, because I thought it was a crazy decision to leave economically. But I did think the shock of such a decision might wake us up on both important domestic issues, but actually on this, and that the UK might really boldly lead a path on, let's call it a cross between the Mark Carney modern view of the world and President Stubb in Finland, in sort of getting real, and that the UK can have a strong relationship with countries that don't actually choose to ever want to be, whatever weird form of democracy we are evolving into.
But again, we're back in the same universe, which is Andy Burnham will observe, as far as we're aware, the red lines of the 2024 manifesto, and is not planning to go further even after an election on customs union and the like, as far as we're aware. So what does an enhanced relationship with the EU mean? Keir Starmer, I feel, sort of attempted to answer that essay question time and time again, and the same obstacles and kind of ultimately mild lack of enthusiasm from the EU side, from a UK that just can't get its ducks quite in a row about what it even wants, being something that means getting a deal that transforms the UK economy in terms of the EU over the line just that much harder.
Well, Keir Starmer makes his farewell appearance on the world stage starting today. I wonder if he will be feeling don't look back in anger or feeling something a little more animated as he heads off on the government's private plane in his swan song trip to the NATO summit in Ankara, a decisive one for the Western Alliance. And what a place to be saying your farewells. Also, of course, the spectre of how Donald Trump is going to handle this and his level of commitment to NATO very much hanging over this event.
Okay, so Keir Starmer will jump on his plane for one of the last times, possibly the last time, and arrive in Turkey early afternoon. He'll meet the British ambassador, sit down with the Norwegian Prime Minister, and then head to a dinner. I think what's notable is that in a break with precedent, the Prime Minister isn't going to answer questions on the way there. Normally, every journalist that's paid a lot of money to travel with the Prime Minister gets an opportunity to ask him one question on the way. They're not doing that. Apparently, they're not doing that today. They might postpone that to tomorrow, so we won't hear from him at all. Maybe there'll be a bit more media than that, but that wasn't the plan going into the summit. So a little bit of a vacuum from the UK side.
All of this leaves the field wide open, Sam, for some random remark or other from Donald Trump, which could dominate the day and certainly overshadow any sense of a legacy summit for our own outgoing leader. Plenty that the US president might fancy opining on at the moment, which is exactly what is worrying those around the Prime Minister and other European leaders. Turkey's President Erdogan, NATO's chief Mark Rutte will make speeches tonight at a dinner. Let's not forget that the reason that this is in Ankara is to try to consolidate Turkey's crucial role in the alliance, but as a somewhat maverick political power there and an authoritarian regime, for no mistake, under President Erdogan. So Yvette Cooper also alongside, she'll have dinner with her opposite numbers. The issue is that it does all feel like something of a leavers tour because nobody knows which job these key British players will be in or out of, except for Keir Starmer himself. So I think getting through it unscathed, getting something nice for the memoirs, and let's not forget, a German general, a NATO general, talking to me a little while ago in the run-up to this, said this is a worrying summit for NATO. I know we've got used to these things being a bit of a tightrope, but if Donald Trump falls on the wrong side of the future of NATO, this has major consequences for us all. So you feel like there's several ring vases being carried across the floor in Ankara for the alliance.
Great. Well, we'll find out what happens later today. Also later today, it's the Politico Playbook Conference where you are going to be interviewing somebody that you'll bring to us on the podcast tomorrow. Who's that?
I'm going to be talking to the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch. She's not going to be short of material, is she? She and my colleagues also bringing in some interviews for our Playbook Live event. So looking forward to that this afternoon.
Good stuff. Okay, we'll be back tomorrow. PMQs without the P and PM, but we'll be back as normal. We will see you then.
How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.